In the quiet, manicured suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, in 1994, a group of men gathered to perform a modern miracle. They were not theologians, nor were they industrial tycoons forging steel or laying railroads. They were mathematicians, academics, and bond traders who believed they had discovered the financial equivalent of the philosopher's stone. They did not look at the market and see fear, greed, or the unpredictable storm of human emotion. They saw only noise, which they believed could be silenced by the perfect equation. They were ostensibly building a hedge fund, but in reality, they were constructing a monument to the ultimate human vanity. The belief that risk can be scientifically eliminated. Now, let us open the archives and dissect the anatomy of this failure. To understand the rise of long-term capital management, we must first understand the intellectual seduction of the era. The late 20th century was the golden age of quantitative finance. The chaotic shouting matches of the trading pits were being replaced by the silent hum of supercomputers. At the center of this revolution stood John Merriweather, a former Salomon Brothers star who possessed a unique talent not for predicting the future, but for collecting talent. He did not merely hire traders, he collected geniuses. His roster read like a fantasy league of academia. Chief among them were Black-Scholes and Robert C. Merton, men who would soon share a Nobel Prize for their work on options pricing. These were the architects of modern finance. They had taken the messy, biological reality of the market and distilled it into the Black-Scholes model, a formula that seemed to impose order upon chaos. Their involvement gave LTCM an aura of infallibility. Investing with Merriweather wasn't seen as gambling. It was seen as deferring to a higher intelligence. Banks didn't just lend to them. They lined up for the privilege, offering financing terms usually reserved for sovereign nations. The core of their strategy was convergence. It was a doctrine of absolute faith in the rationality of markets. The models dictated that, over time, the relationship between different assets, say, a U.S. Treasury bond and a slightly less liquid foreign bond, must align. If they drifted apart, it was an anomaly, a temporary glitch in the matrix that the market would inevitably correct. LTCM would sell the expensive asset and buy the cheap one, waiting for the two prices to converge like magnets snapping back together. They were arbitrageurs, picking up pennies from the floor of the stock exchange. But they were picking them up with a steam shovel. Because the discrepancies they hunted were microscopic, the profits on any single trade were negligible. To turn these pennies into billions, they required leverage, massive, ungodly leverage. For every dollar of their own capital, they borrowed $20, $30, sometimes $100 from eager banks. They built a towering engine of debt, fueled by the certainty that their models were correct. And for a time, they were. In their first years, LTCM didn't just beat the market, they humiliated it. They returned 21% in their first year, 43% in the second, and 41% in the third. In the painted portraits of their success, we see them not as gamblers, but as masters of the universe, sitting in their glass-walled offices, watching the curves on their screens obey their commands. It appeared they had solved the riddle of economics. They had seemingly removed the human element from the ledger, replacing the erratic pulse of the trader with the cold precision of the algorithm. But in this pursuit of efficiency, they had succumbed to a dangerous blindness. Their models were built on historical data, on the bell curves of the past. They assumed that the future would resemble the past, that volatility would remain within standard deviations, and that markets would always remain liquid. They viewed the world through the lens of physics, where the laws of gravity are constant, They forgot they were operating in the realm of psychology, where the laws can change the moment panic sets in. They had built a machine designed for a fair weather sea, unaware that they were sailing straight into a chaotic, 100-year storm that their history book said was statistically impossible. The architecture of disaster is rarely built overnight. It is usually constructed slowly, brick by brick, upon a foundation of quiet arrogance. By the summer of 1998, long-term capital management was no longer just a hedge fund. It was a leviathan. Its tentacles were wrapped around nearly every major financial market on the planet. With over $100 billion in assets and a derivative book with a notional value of over $1 trillion, it had become the central nervous system of Wall Street. The partners believed they had diversified their risk perfectly, spreading their bets across nations, currencies, and asset classes. Their models assured them that the probability of all these markets moving against them simultaneously was a statistical absurdity, an event as likely as the sun failing to rise. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor when it comes to the certainty of men. The trouble began in the East. The Asian contagion of 1997 had left global markets jittery, like a herd of gazelles sensing a predator in the tall grass. Investors were nervous, seeking safety. In this climate of unease, LTCM did not retreat. They doubled down. Their models interpreted the market volatility not as a warning, but as an opportunity, a mispricing to be exploited. They sold volatility, effectively selling insurance to a terrified world, collecting premiums on the assumption that the storm would pass. Then came the Russian winter. Russia, in 1998, was a chaotic frontier market, struggling to transition from Soviet command economics to capitalism. It was issuing short-term debt, known as GKOs, with astronomical yields to attract foreign capital. To the Nobel laureates at LTCM, this was simply a math problem. The yields were too high compared to the risk. The spread had to narrow. They bet heavily that Russia would not default. After all, nuclear powers do not simply stop paying their bills. On August 17, 1998, the impossible happened. Russia devalued the ruble and defaulted on its domestic debt. In the sterilized, air-conditioned trading rooms of Greenwich, the models simply ceased to function. The computers had been programmed for a world of rational actors and continuous liquidity. They were not programmed for a world where a G7 nation would simply walk away from its obligations. The immediate financial loss was painful, but it should not have been fatal. The true executioner was not the Russian default itself, but the psychological contagion it triggered. This is the mechanism that the efficiency myth always fails to account for. Fear. When the default hit, a phenomenon known as a flight to quality swept through the global financial system. In a panic, investors do not care about yield, or math, or theoretical value. They care only about liquidity. They want their money back, and they want it in the safest container possible. Capital fled from anything that smelled of risk and poured into the only sanctuary left: the newest, most liquid U.S. Treasury bonds, known as on-the-run treasuries. This was the precise moment the trap snapped shut on LTCM. A core component of their strategy involved arbitrage between these on-the-run treasuries and slightly older, off-the-run treasuries. The older bonds were technically identical in credit quality, but traded at a slight discount because they were harder to sell. LTCM was long the cheap, illiquid old bonds and short the expensive, liquid new bonds. They were betting the price gap would close. Instead, as the panic set in, the gap ripped open. Everyone on Wall Street was frantically buying the new bonds and selling the old ones. The spread, which the models said could not mathematically exceed a certain width, blew out to historic proportions. The tragedy of leverage is that it does not allow for the luxury of time. If you are trading with your own money, you can wait for the market to regain its senses. When you are leveraged nearly 3-0-1, as LTCM was, you are driving a car with a dagger mounted on the steering wheel. A slight bump in the road pierces the heart. By September, the fund was bleeding tens of millions of dollars an hour. The partners, men who had spent their lives studying the theoretical movement of prices, were now staring at screens that displayed a reality their equations said could not exist. Correlation, a measure of how different assets move in relation to one another, suddenly went to 1. In a crisis, the only thing that rises is correlation. Stocks, junk bonds, emerging market debt, everything fell together. The diversification that was supposed to protect them vanished. The dream team was paralyzed. They watched as their equity, the capital trusted to them by universities, pension funds, and wealthy families, evaporated. In a desperate bid to stay afloat, they needed to sell assets. But here lay the cruelest irony of all. They were so large, so dominant, that they were the market. To sell their positions was to crash the price of those positions further. They were a whale trying to turn around in a bathtub. The other sharks on Wall Street, the very banks that had lent them billions, smelled the blood in the water. They knew LTCM's positions. They knew the fund was distressed. Instead of helping, the market began to trade against them, front-running their liquidation, driving prices down further to force a total collapse. It was a predatory feedback loop, a brutal demonstration of the game theory the professors had taught in classrooms, now weaponized against them. On September 21, the fund lost $550 million in a single day. The capital base, once standing proudly at $4.7 billion at the start of the year, had shriveled to a fraction of that. The leverage ratio skyrocketed to over 1:1. They were insolvent. The Nobel Prize winners had not just lost money, they had effectively created a black hole in the center of the global financial system. If they collapsed, they would drag the lenders, every major bank, from New York to Zurich, down into the abyss with them. The silence in the Greenwich office was heavy, the kind of silence that follows a catastrophic explosion. The equations had failed. The perfect machine was broken, and the phone began to ring. It wasn't a client. It was the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is a fortress of limestone and iron, a cathedral to the stability of the dollar. On September 23, 1998, it became a trauma center. In an unprecedented move, the Fed did not bail out long-term capital management directly with public money. Instead, it summoned the heads of Wall Street's most powerful banks, Merrill Lynch, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and others, into a conference room and locked the door. The message from the Fed was stark. You created this monster. You fed it the leverage. Now, you must pay to dismantle it safely. The scene inside that room was a tableau of high-stakes coercion. These men, bitter rivals who spent their days trying to slit each other's throats for a basis point of market share, were forced to pool their own capital to save a competitor. It was not an act of charity. It was an act of self-preservation. They looked at LTCM's books and saw the terrifying reality. The web of derivatives was so complex, so interconnected, that a disorderly default would likely freeze the payment systems of the global economy. They put up $3.6 billion to take over the fund, essentially buying a controlled demolition of the failed experiment. The dream team was washed out. The partners lost their personal fortunes. The Nobel laureates, who had been feted as oracles, were left to sift through the wreckage of their reputations. The bailout prevented a global depression, but it cemented a dangerous precedent. The concept of too big to fail. It signaled to the financial world that if you gamble big enough and recklessly enough, the state will ensure you do not die, for fear of the contagion you carry. The autopsy of long-term capital management reveals a truth far darker than simple incompetence. It exposes the fatal flaw in the doctrine of efficiency. The professors believe that markets are efficient, that prices reflect all available information, and that risk can be measured like the temperature of a gas. They forgot that markets are not composed of atoms. They are composed of people. People who panic, people who follow the herd, people who are irrational. Their models worked perfectly in a vacuum, but they suffocated in the atmosphere of the real world. They mistook the map for the territory. They believed that because an event had never happened in their data set, it could not happen. This is the inductive fallacy, the belief that because the sun has risen every day of your life, it is guaranteed to rise tomorrow. But in finance, the sun can simply extinguish itself without warning. LTCM was the ultimate expression of the modern financial hubris, the belief that mathematics can conquer human nature. It proved that you can have the highest IQs in the room, the deepest pockets, and the most sophisticated technology, and still be undone by the oldest, most primitive force in the market, the stampede. In the end, the story of long-term capital management is a modern fable of Icarus, rewritten in the language of derivatives. They built wings of mathematical wax and flew toward the sun of infinite yield, only to be melted by the heat of reality. Their legacy is a stark reminder that in the grand casino of the global economy, the house may not always win, but the player who believes he has solved the game is always the first to lose. Models may predict the future, but they cannot control it. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.